Hi again. The next panel that we have is the Health and Climate Community Action Panel. And this is a pretty exciting one for me because I had the great honor of meeting Jacqueline Patterson, who's going to be on the panel, a few years ago in my very first nonprofit bigwig job. And after meeting her, I was like, I'm going to do sustainability for the rest of my life. So it's really just an honor to be able to see her again in person and be able to also introduce Nataki Osborne-Jelks, who will be the moderator for today's panel. Dr. Nataki Osborne-Jelks is an assistant professor in the Environmental and Health Sciences program at Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia. Dr. Jelks investigates urban environmental health disparities, the role that place, race, and social factors play in influencing health, cumulative risk assessment, the impact of climate change on vulnerable populations, and the connection between urban watersheds, pollution, the built environment, and health. She also develops, implements, and evaluates community-based initiatives that set conditions to enable low-income and communities of color to empower themselves, to reduce exposure to environmental health hazards, and improve health and quality of life. Jelks is particularly interested in approaches that engage environmentally overburdened communities in monitoring local environmental conditions, generating actionable data for community change, and developing effective community-based interventions that revitalize toxic, degraded spaces into healthy places. Dr. Jelks co-founded the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance, a community-based environmental justice organization that works to grow a cleaner, greener, healthier, more sustainable West Atlanta through authentic community engagement, organizing, education, community science, and participatory research. Since 2018, she has served on the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, a federal advisory committee that works to integrate environmental justice into the Environmental Protection Agency's programs, policies, and activities, as well as to improve the environment or public health in communities disproportionately burdened by environmental harms and risk. Please help me welcome Dr. Jelks.
Thank you so much, Brittany. So I am really excited, delighted, and honored to introduce just an amazing panel today. We have 3 panelists who are here in person with us. We have one who will be joining us via Zoom. And when I think about health and climate community action, I cannot really think of a better group. We have a group of women who are scholars, who are activists, who are doing the work directly with frontline communities, but who are also making some scholarly contributions to important issues like achieving climate, environmental, and health justice. We have one of our panelists who is looking specifically at issues around climate change and how it impacts mental health of women and also of the family unit. And so we're pleased to invite them to be with us. I'd like to first introduce Jackie Patterson. Jackie is the founder and executive director of the Chisholm Legacy Project, a resource hub for Black frontline climate leadership. And I'll just give some brief introductions because in the opening remarks that each of the panelists give, they will introduce themselves and their work in their own way. So I'll give you just maybe a sentence or two about each. I got a chance to meet Jackie in her role as the founding senior director, of the NAACP's Environmental and Climate Justice Program, where she served for over a decade. And it was really transformational, I think, when she came into this role to have an organization that has for so many years been focused on issues of equity and justice, also center those issues on environmental and climate justice challenges and struggles. And so in that work, she has worked hand in hand with leaders of frontline community organizations in the Black community in particular, but not exclusively. And so her work it precedes her. So Jackie, I'd like to bring you to the stage. Let's give her a round of applause, please. Next, I'd like to introduce to the stage Dr. Jennifer Barkin. Dr. Barkin is an associate professor of community medicine and obstetrics and gynecology at Mercer University. She developed the Barkin Index of Maternal Functioning to assess how a woman functions in new motherhood. She's also now leading a team that is building an index to measure the impact of climate change on mental health, and is conducting research to determine how and to what degree changes in the environment affect a person's mental health, and again, looking also at the family unit. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Barkin to the stage next. And let's give her a round of applause. Next, I'd like to bring forward Ellen Spears, who is a professor in the Department of American Studies at the University of Alabama. And Ellen is an old colleague who I've admired for a number of years. She does amazing work in the area of environmental history. I really got a chance to know Ellen's work because of two pieces, not necessarily her most recent book, but two books. One was the story of the Newtown Florist Club, a community-based organization in Gainesville, Georgia, and their fight and struggle for environmental justice, led by Faye Bush, who is just a giant in the environmental justice movement. So I first got to know Ellen's work by reading and interacting with that publication. Then her next book, Baptized in PCPs, told the story of communities struggling for environmental justice in Anniston, Alabama. And she has some more recent work that is taking sort of a critical look at environmental activism, the history of environmental activism in this country, and now focusing in on really what's been happening in the South. We think about the South and the Southeast as, always being sort of behind. When you think about health indicators, for instance, we think about education. We're thinking about the South sort of being, at the bottom. But Ellen is also looking at how the South has been leading. When we talk about environmental activism, not specifically just environmental justice, but environmental activism from a broader perspective. So thank you, Ellen, for joining us. And then our last panelist, and I'm not sure if we've been able to get her connected to the line yet, but hopefully that will happen shortly, and that will be Ms. Michelle Roberts. Michelle Roberts is the co-director of the Environmental Justice Health Alliance for Chemical Policy Reform. And I've gotten a chance to know Michelle in my role serving on the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council. She is an amazing activist. She's a scientist, an activist, an artist, and she really brings all of these mediums together to advance environmental justice, working hand in hand with frontline communities, especially as it relates to issues around toxic pollution and communities' exposure to that pollution. So when we get Michelle connected, we will clap, snap, whatever it is that you want to do, but we will welcome her into the conversation as well. So as we try to get Michelle roped in, we're going to go ahead and get started with our panelists who are here on the stage with us. And so we'll first ask Jackie to start. And so there are mics at your seats, so feel free to stay. We want to have a conversation. And so each of the panelists is going to talk to us for about 7 to 10 minutes, giving us just an overview of who they are and what their work is as it relates to this topic of health and climate community action. So Jackie, we'll start with you, and then we'll just come down the line with Dr. Barkin, Dr. Spears, and then we'll end with Michelle Roberts.
Thank you. Yeah, so good afternoon, everyone, once again. So I am thrilled to be able to share a little bit about the Chisholm Legacy Project, which just was born on July 1st, which was also my birthday. So it was symbolic. And talking and really framing this whole issue around environmental justice and health in the context of what the impetus was for starting the Chisholm Legacy Project. I was born on the south side of Chicago, Illinois, born to immigrant father who was from Jamaica, West Indies, and from my mom who came up, who migrated from Dublin, Mississippi through the quote unquote Great Migration. And so I lived in a family of that was both an immigrant home as well as a very southern culture home. And growing up, it was the innocence of youth on the south side of Chicago where, it was hopscotch, it was double Dutch jump roping, it was waiting for the sound of the ice cream truck and running outside with glee. But it was also the sounds of gunshots. It was the Black Pea Stone Nation and the El Rookin gangs that were in our community. It was the kids in our church with kids in our school with asthma and the people in our church with COPD. It was these silent kind of, in some ways, visible yet invisible killers in our community, the three coal-fired power plants that were within a 10-mile radius of where I lived, the landfill that was near where I lived, where they were all there, but they weren't something that we knew were as threats. We just knew that people had asthma, people had COPD. This was just the way life was. We knew that we had these gangs, and that was the only place that we lived and grew. So we just thought everybody probably had these gangs. We looked at TV. We didn't really see much gang representation on TV, but we didn't see TV as really a reflection of society, because when we looked at news, we saw the news that reflected our communities. And so growing up, I didn't know what I didn't know in terms of now returning all these decades later and working on the two coal-fired power plants, which in the cold-blooded report that we put out were the top two worst-ranked coal-fired power plants in the nation in terms of the level of sulfur dioxide and the nitrogen oxides they emitted, and the fact that they were located in communities of color, and black and Latino communities in particular. So fast forward to where I live now in Baltimore, Maryland. It's another situation where, we all know about the Freddie Gray situation, and, became the epicenter of the Black Lives Matter movement, where it was really quite striking to see the military, the National Guard, occupying our streets in that summer in 2015, and to be in lockdown and curfew in that summer of 2015. I mean, just right there in Baltimore, where the same place where I would hang out at the harbor, again, just with kind of an idyllic life. And so, and it reminded me of when I was in the Democratic Republic of Congo doing international relief work, and seeing the militarization of that situation. And so as we think about the communities, the threats and the systems that drive these challenges, we put out a report called Fossil Fueled Foolery, and we saw the ties between moneyed interests and everything from the prison industrial complex that makes our streets unsafe to the military industrial complex that makes the proliferation of militarism so extreme, and the ways that the tie between money and power in terms of the fossil fuel industry drives the fact that these facilities in our communities, where it's the cheapest for them to operate and where they consider the lives in our communities to be disposable. So as I wrap up my remarks, the work of the Chisholm Legacy Project is to really ensure that communities have and movements have self-determination. Our work is working with communities to develop a vision of not just surviving, which unfortunately too many in our communities don't, but actually being able to thrive, to really be able to achieve the ideals of liberty and justice for all across the board, without regard to race or color or ethnicity or any of these things that serve as separations now. So our work is doing trainings, our work is doing coaching, our work is doing capacity building, connecting people with technical, informational, and financial resources so that we can rise to be the communities that are already finding liberation. We have communities like the Earthsea Collective in Durham, where they're growing their own food and really experiencing self-determination. We have the Local Clean Energy Alliance in Oakland, where they're developing microgrids, and communities are not experiencing shutoffs or experiencing coal-fired power plants that are polluting their communities. They can actually take for granted, just like other people have, turning on the lights and actually having lights and energy in their homes. People like the We the People of Detroit that are really taking back their water systems and recognizing that they should also have governance over their water systems. And so these are the kind of examples that we want to proliferate and have be the norm, so that self-determination becomes the order of the day, as opposed to just trying to survive in a system that's literally built to keep you where you are. So hope springs eternal, and that's the work that we have already started to do, and the work that we look forward to linking with folks on stage and otherwise to do more of. So thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Barkin. I'm an associate professor at Mercer University School of Medicine in Macon, Georgia, so about an hour and 15 minutes south. My appointments are in the Department of Community Medicine and Obstetrics and Gynecology. July 1, I just took on the vice chair role for our department, which entails running 3 academic programs. We're kind of the public health unit of the medical school, which works well with my background. I did all of my training in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, so I'm a native Pennsylvanian. I just moved here 9 years ago. My degrees are in statistics, biostatistics, and epidemiology. I did a postdoc at Western Psychiatric Institute and Clinic in psychiatric epidemiology, and then kind of did a kind of global faculty search. Not quite sure if I was even willing to leave Pittsburgh at that point, because I was pregnant with my son, and a lot of our family is still in Pittsburgh. But lo and behold, I interviewed, and this is kind of not to read off my CV, but to just kind of give you an idea of how I got to where I'm at in terms of the climate research. So where was I? Yeah. So anyway, I did a global search, and I got a call from Mercer's Macon campus and Savannah campus, and came, and I literally knew with every fiber of my being that it was the next right job, which I had both feelings of extreme excitement and dread, because I knew it was going to really upset my parents, taking away their sort of like their first grandchild. It was because he was in the area. So anyway, fast forward, and I come to Mercer. What I kind of didn't mention was something really significant during my doctoral research. I had always been interested in mental health. So mental health has been at the core of my research program since the beginning. Even after I got the master's degree in biostatistics, I worked on a big multi-center clinical trials of chronic depression and treatment-resistant depression as an analyst. So I knew I wanted to keep moving on the mental health track. My boss at the time introduced me to a professor named Catherine Wisner, who's a pioneer in the field of perinatal mental health. And she said, well, we really need, as I was looking for a doctoral project, we really need a measure that assesses postpartum functioning. So at that point, and we still do, we have more now, measures that assess depression status, right? When you think of postpartum, you think of postpartum depression. Now, postpartum anxiety has gotten a lot more traction recently. But so we developed this measure as part of my dissertation, and I had kind of the right background to do it in statistics and psychometrics. So it was a 20-item measure, self-report measure of maternal functioning in the first year postpartum. So what we didn't expect was that we knew that it would be used in academia and community-based settings. What kind of took us by surprise, a good surprise, was that a company named Sage Therapeutics, and they'd be thrilled that I'm talking about them right now, it's good advertising, but they developed a drug, the first ever drug for postpartum depression called brexanolone. Now it's called Zulresso. But the Barkin Index got picked up in the clinical trials and used as an outcomes measure, which was blew us away. And so it got licensed a whole bunch of times because of those clinical trials, and they've built on that line of drugs. So it was an FDA breakthrough medication big moment for my career. And so I kept focused on the maternal functioning space and postpartum anxiety, et cetera. So moving on to kind of how I got into climate, I'd always been interested in the environment. So that was kind of, if I look back, that was always playing in the background. Because to me, as a public health person, this is like the mother of all public health crises. And I don't say that to be gloom and doom, because I think there's incredible opportunity in it. But I think it's about as big as it gets in terms of something that needs our attention and is systemic and has a critical time element. So anyway, as I kind of progressing in my career at Mercer, and I'm working with groups to implement the Barkin Index, and I think about motherhood, the stresses of it. I have 2 children of my own. About 4 years into my time in Georgia, I just noticed my allergies got like exponentially worse. It was like a rocket ship took off, and I had allergies before, but I mean to tell you they were so bad, I couldn't watch like my son's soccer game outside, or I would be dizzy and sick. And so, I got on shots, and eventually it got a bit better. But as I was in the middle of all this, I started kind of researching air quality and the interaction between heat and air pollution and aeroallergens, and how, because I had the distinct feeling, even though Georgia's different than Pennsylvania in terms of its vegetation, but I had the distinct feeling that there was more than that going on. And then simultaneously, my kids would come home, on really hot days when they were outside for recess, and say, "Mom, I don't feel good. I don't feel good when I'm outside." And it coincided with days that were really hot, where the air quality was poor. So I kind of started delving in then. But I also was thinking about, if this worries me as a mother, imagine if you're in a high-risk area for extreme weather like Puerto Rico, or now, high risk, the definition is changing, right? Because we're all kind of at risk. That path is narrowing in terms of safe space in regards to climate. So in terms of extreme weather, I just started thinking about, God, as a mother, you're worrying about your kids. You notice your kid's asthma is getting worse, or if you're in coastal Florida, you've got a whole other host of worries. So this kind of connection between mental health and motherhood kind of captured my attention. And this kind of led to 3 different branches of work that is an extension of my existing research program, and that we're looking at, just had a paper published on extreme weather and child mental health. So all of the kind of psychological symptoms and circumstances that come from a child going through a traumatic natural disaster. And that was a pretty thorough lit review across all weather events, so wildfires, tornadoes, tropical storms, etc. So I took that same model and moved it over to the perinatal space, where we're looking at women of childbearing age and how natural disaster exposure impacted their mental health. So that's another part of it. And then I decided to apply my skills as a measurement development person to develop a measure of climate distress. So we did interviews, and we have a beta version of the measure, and we're about to do psychometric testing. The things is a little bit different now about developing this index from when I did the Barkin Index. Is I was a student and an unknown at the time, so nobody really knew about the work. This time around, the word has gotten out, and I'm actually, the media is a little bit ahead of where we're at with the product. So we have a good product, and it's in testing, but I can see why people, not that it's anywhere near on the scale, but the vaccine developers probably put under a little stress to get it out. But it's a good sign, because it means there's attention on this issue. And then the third piece of it, which I think is one of the most powerful, is that being in a medical school, we have the power to shape the curriculum to some degree. So right away, as vice chair, I've put a course in on climate change, the effects of climate change on clinical practice. So how does it affect differential diagnosis, healthcare delivery, et cetera? So to me, that's almost one of the most powerful and gratifying, because if you have 150 medical students and they're all of a sudden getting that information. It's like training a physician army to go be better prepared when they deliver, patient care regarding the effects of climate change on their patient population. Thank you.
Well, hi, I'm Ellen Griffith Spears. I teach at the University of Alabama, and I want to thank Nataki for convening us and for all of the organizers at Agnes Scott, Susan Kidd and Caroline, so many people who worked on putting all this together. My own trajectory, in a way, starts with a different migration. Actually, my mother grew up in Southwest Virginia and migrated to industrial Baltimore during World War II to work as a mechanical craftsperson in the wartime electrical industry. Later, as I grew up, I watched some of her struggles in a male-dominated profession, and it was only much later that I realized that those same electrical circuits carried the chemicals which I'm going to talk to you about today, PCBs, and may well have exposed some of the people who worked in those jobs. But I have a few slides to share, also by way of talking about some of the influences on my work. The first, Nataki mentioned actually, and these are three amazing women from the Newtown Florist Club, Faye Bush, Mosette Welshel, and Geraldine Collins. And they were leaders of this amazing group of women in North Georgia who, in their ordinary work of their community work of taking care of people who were sick, began to figure out that they had serious environmental health problems in their neighborhood. And fast forward to a decade or so later, I worked with Cassandra Roberts there to write the story about chemical contamination in Anniston, Alabama. She's there pictured with Cheryl Marcus from the Southern Organizing Committee for Social and Economic Justice, one of the organizations that had worked with local people in Anniston and actually around the South. And so these are some of the folks who I look to for inspiration, who against all odds went up against one of the largest agrochemical companies in the world, and some of their counterparts actually took on pollution at the U.S. Army depot nearby. The chemical of contamination, the chemical of concern in Anniston is PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls. They are now, as of 1976, were banned by Congress because they're so pervasive and toxic. Yet they still, the EPA estimated in 2010 that 75 million pounds of them still are in use in little transformers and capacitor motors, even old fluorescent light ballasts have some PCBs in them. So it's a chemical of global concern, a contaminant of global concern. This gives you an example of just how seriously exposed this environmental justice community in Anniston has been. Just comparing the numbers here, you can see that the PCB exposures of adults tested in Anniston were 4 times greater than the NHANES, that's the National Environmental Health and Nutrition Evaluation Survey, Examination Survey shows. So 4 to 1, more serious exposures than many industrial contamination sites in the workplace exposures around the world. The other thing about the Anniston case is it sadly showed grim confirmation of environmental injustice. The survey that was taken showed that African Americans in Anniston who were tested had more than 2 times higher total PCBs than their white neighbors. And so this is, a very clear case of environmental injustice on the local level that gives you an understanding of the seriousness of the evidence of disparities that exists. And that's because we know from more than 18,000 health studies that PCBs contribute to serious health effects, neurotoxicity in children. The International Agency for Research on Cancer shows that it's a carcinogenic chemical. Various tests, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Immune disorders, particularly important in the current situation I'll talk about in a moment. Diabetes and cardiovascular disease are associated, as well as endocrine and thyroid disorders. So serious contamination leads to health problems in several different areas. So what does this have to do with climate? We're talking today about climate and health. A warming climate has serious effects on chemical contaminants. For example, in a warming world, PCBs, they're not water soluble, but they travel on sediment and they contaminate the waterways, the Choccolocco Creek and the Coosa River in Alabama. 45 miles of waterways, the EPA says, are contaminated. And so contaminant movement and behavior is going to change as we have more flooding, more climate disasters. Contaminant health effects can shift. The kinds of exposures that people face, the increased susceptibility to various pathogens, increases in cardio and respiratory disease, and allergic reactions as well. And of course, it can have an effect in wildlife settings as well. You can see that the hazards associated with toxic chemicals then are exacerbated in the warming climate situation. We have some more here. There we go. This is a global problem. PCBs were only made in a very few places, only 2 places in the United States, but they're a global contaminant. And this chart, I don't know if you can see it well, but it shows at the bottom the manufacturer in Anniston and also made in Western Illinois. But a PCB molecule travels around the globe, not just because the electrical motors and transformers that they were placed in were shipped around the globe, but they travel in airways, on settlement. They end up, interestingly enough, because of the way they move in the landscape and in the oceans, they end up embedded in disproportionate amounts in Arctic ice. And so when you have global warming and that ice melting, you're going to have remobilization of the toxic chemicals. You can see these huge numbers of exposures in wildlife in the polar regions, and those chemicals are going to be remobilized into the atmosphere. So what about in the COVID era? How does this change once again? And communities have serious impact, already vulnerable communities. We've seen this reported rather widely in the press about how vulnerable communities have been especially vulnerable to the coronavirus and high levels of disease, high levels of hospitalization. You've got vulnerable communities with higher level of underlying conditions or comorbidities are going to be more likely to have serious COVID disease levels. PCBs and other toxic chemicals, of course, I'm using PCBs as an example, but there are many chemicals in this arena we saw above, inhibit immune responses. This is what we're counting on is the body's immune systems kicking in to counter serious disease. And so chemical exposures have a negative impact on that and may diminish vaccine effectiveness. So it's a serious situation, and we're also asked to talk about what to do about it. What are the hopeful signs? What are the things that impel us forward to work on these issues? People this morning referred to the need for system change, and that's absolutely necessary. And there are very specific ways that we can tackle these issues. Multiple fronts, reducing exposure to toxic chemical contamination, including robust cleanup and broader remedy for impacted communities, going after the top carbon emitters so as to reduce climate change, and effectively curbing the spread of disease. And just to very briefly elaborate on some of those, Congress passed finally in 2016, President Obama signed a revision to that law in 1976 that banned PCBs. The Toxic Substances Control Act was updated, but it didn't go far enough. It needs to be much stronger. The Environmental Justice Act of Congressman Lewis and then Senator Al Gore introduced in 1992. Now it's almost 30 years later, Congress has still not passed an Environmental Justice Act, and that should be very much on the agenda. On the climate front, we've seen some recent successes. The halting of the Dakota Access route, the blocking of the northern route of the Keystone Pipeline, the stopping of the planned pipeline at Memphis, a clear environmental justice victory. It represented a determined coalition of indigenous populations of Standing Rock and beyond, farmers, self-described cowboys, environmental activists, and many more. And so the upcoming meeting in Glasgow will prove consequential on the kinds of global climate policy we see going forward. Societies have rebounded from epidemics before, and here too, reparative action is absolutely critical. The conservative backlash on, really it's a 40+ year assault on targeted remedies, affirmative remedies like affirmative action that have been blocked. I was very pleased to hear earlier Dr. Martinez talk about the Justice 40 program, a movement that's active within government to develop targeted remedies that serve underserved populations, communities of color and others who have been living in the environmental justice communities. And we need to see much more targeting of the most vulnerable in our governmental efforts to promote public health. So as I noted at the outset, talking about my mother, talking about Faye Bush and the others, talking about Cassandra Roberts, women have always been leaders in these struggles. And we can find hope in really looking at the successes that they have achieved as we move forward to build the kind of coalitions that are needed to make these changes happen.
Thank you so much, Ellen. Now I understand that we do have Michelle Roberts connected. We will hear from her momentarily, but there is going to be a video that will introduce her remarks.
When Mossville was established, it was equally known as the richest in biodiversity of all of Louisiana.
Our people lived on the land. All their agriculture was livestock, fish, game, and other things that they lived on. When my parents got there, the plants wasn't there. The land or the earth hadn't been tampered with. It was beautiful.
I met the Bennetts in 2009, and they're part of Mossville Environmental Action Now, who formed in order to fight back against the toxics that they knew were creating health issues.
When Conoco came in, the facility became the new eastern neighborhood of Mossville, and they bought up 690 acres of land, bought it for pennies.
Environmental racism is the injustices that are plagued on these particular spaces where we live, work, worship, pray, and go to school in egregious forms.
We were smelling different odors, but we didn't know what it was. We were ignorant to that. My parents didn't know what it was. The older people didn't know.
There are roughly 18 industrial facilities that surround Mossville and choke them like a donut.
A lot of it was asthma, respiratory problem, with kidney problem. Then all of a sudden cancer came. They were killing us every day. My niece was 15 years old. She went in for an asthma problem. They said her nasal passage needed opening up. They took half of her face off because she had cancer in her nasal passage at 15 years old.
60% of the oil and gas refining business comes through that of the Gulf Coast.
Refineries are the main source of income in this area, and they will not shake that foundation, especially for a little small Black community that exists in Southwest Louisiana.
The most recent industrial facility, Sasol, is out of South Africa to build what they're proposing is the largest ever ethylene oxide cracker. So Mossville now is the experiment.
The plants are growing more and more. They're getting bigger and bigger, and everybody, like the LNG plants, are coming in. Our president was just here to welcome one of our largest LNG plants.
From right here in Hackberry, Louisiana, you will very soon be exporting clean American natural gas all over the globe. And it's clean and it's environmentally better than the alternatives. You know that.
When you look at someone like the Mossville community, communities that may have formed themselves out of another injustice, such as slavery, and now here it is, they're up against another big economic engine that targets them for who they are, specifically because of the fact that they are Black and brown and or poor.
There's a handful of people like my wife and myself who continue to try to make things better for themselves. There's no one looking out for it.
What they want is to have the beloved community to be made whole.
Our life is in danger, and we need to start knowing what industries are doing to our people, especially our children.
We are standing on the shoulders of the many who come before us to stand for justice. We hope that this story will help all of us dig deep into our moral courage to make sure that no community is ever left behind. Good afternoon, Agnes Scott. Good afternoon, family. Thank you for welcoming us, the Environmental Justice Health Alliance for Chemical Policy Reform, into this space today. Building Better World, Women and Climate Justice. I come into this space, daughter of Jacqueline and Les Roberts of Wilmington, Delaware. Yes, like Joseph R. Biden, I too am from Wilmington, Delaware, but I am located in Washington, D.C. My parents were part of their actual school. The Howard High School was part of the Brown v. Board education. And today we come, legacy communities, the Environmental Justice Health Alliance for Chemical Policy Reform, EJHA, as we say, sharing why we come into this space. We are the families and communities of those who have been impacted by some of our nation's most egregious systemic racism issues, all tied up in a tiny little bow and knot that takes itself into now what we call an extreme climate crisis. And if that's not enough, we are in the crosshairs of a pandemic. And yet again, it is the people of color and the poor who are the most subjected to all of this. Our people say we have enough. And that is how I came into this situation. I am actually a proud graduate. You might think I have Spelman Blue on today, but I give a shout out to Spelman and equally that of Morgan State University, the university that I hail from, where we were taught to serve the community, where I graduated as a proud science graduate. You know, they said there were no Blacks in science, but then there were all of us who had solutions, those solutions that came to bear for our communities. This is what we do in the Environmental Justice Health Alliance. I'm formerly an environmental scientist. And at the particular time I came online as an environmental scientist, I trained as a wetlands biologist, but was catapulted into working on toxics for local communities and saw the disconnect not only in communities, but my own personal family. Many types of cancers, heart diseases, sudden infant death syndrome, you name it, all types of health disparities. But the sadness is we continue to speak to disparities while the disparities wind up exacerbating their own selves. We say we have solutions, but do we have the real moral and political courage we need to make those solutions come to bear? What do we mean by that? My colleagues, I'm so proud to be on this esteemed panel with all of you. We hear everything from the Toxic Substance Control Act failure. Yeah, there was a failure with that. The failure is that we left hot spots out and the most egregious situations that we need to change, where we need a serious regime change and reform, as we say, yes, systems change, changing our chemicals management systems to reflect that of safer chemicals and safer processes. Why do we have schools located within a 1 mile radius, if you will, of a high risk management facility? And we continue to talk about we're in the crosshairs of a climate crisis. But the good news is that we have women like Faye Bush from the Newtown Women's Florist. We had women like Connie Tucker, who organized the Southern Organizing Projects, SOC committee, excuse me. And many of those folks who came in 1991 to the government seat saying that we need to bring our solutions to bear. We need to not only show what these challenges are, and yes, it's all rooted in systemic racism, but equally we have solutions and we have a set of principles. And in those principles, if we don't advance these pieces, we will see some real serious challenges, such as what we see today in the climate crisis. But the good news is The many voices and the many communities who remain committed and steadfast to build for a building and better just world, united in a process called the National Climate, the, excuse me, the National Climate Platform, as you heard Dr. Cecilia Martinez speak to earlier today. And with that, in that platform space, we created a set of platform principles with those pieces speaking to the fact that we leave no community behind. We must be able to address legacy communities, address cumulative impacts. It is one thing to discuss addressing the carbon challenge, but we have a multiplicity of emissions impacting our communities, which impact us globally. Therefore, we need the moral and political courage and will to push for a mandatory emissions reduction. We need to address a pollution free economy. No one should be placed at risk. If we are speaking to building a better world for women and climate justice, we must dig deep into our moral and political courage and educate, organize, and mobilize ourselves to understand that we push, especially thank you, Georgia, for taking us over. But we must continue to make sure people can vote in Georgia and the states that are under hostile threats. Because this past week, we have been able to, as a people, move this United States Congress, good, bad, or indifferent, but we have placed environmental justice into this reconciliation package. Now it is up to we, the people, to move it forward. This is what we are talking about, building a better world, women, and climate justice. This is what we're doing in the Equitable and Just Climate platform. This is what we're doing with our affiliates in the Environmental Justice Health Alliance for Chemical Policy Reform, our legacy communities, who utilize the demographic data and the reports and all of these wonderful books that we all have been able to produce and write, but for them to move for a more perfect union so that we can all have the human right to live and breathe a healthy environment and drink clean water and live in a more sustainable world. Thank you, Agnes Scott. We're looking forward to building a better world with you for the sake of our communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. And I think with what we heard with each panelist, we got a sense of the work that they've been engaged in, but there was kind of like this call to action at the end, a look ahead in terms of the work that needs to be done. And so I'm thankful for that. I'd like to ask maybe one question of my own. Some of my questions I feel like were addressed in some of the remarks that were made in terms of the things that we should be looking to advance and to push. What are the resources and capacities that are most needed by communities to advance climate and health justice? I feel like we heard some of that in some of those comments. What is it that we need to do to try to, elevate these issues around mental health in the context of climate change and the stress and trauma associated with experiencing its effects? And so I'm really encouraged by the work that Dr. Barkin talked about with, sort of arming or equipping, if you will, this army of physicians, to look at these issues. So I felt like there was a lot of conversation about some of these solutions. But I feel like I want to take it just back to the beginning. Each of us are women. We all talked about the work of women or impacts on women, and we may have elevated some women who have inspired us. We talked about the plight of women in this fight. And so I want to ask, maybe it's an obvious question, but I want to hear from some of the panelists, why is it, and Dr. Spears mentioned this, so she said, women are leading many of these struggles, but why is it? Why do we see women at the forefront of environmental and climate justice activism, whether we're talking about that from our perspectives as scholars and researchers, or those of us who are working on the front lines, hand in hand with communities, trying to ensure that communities have what it is that they need to advance these fights? Why are women at the forefront? Can I ask Jackie first to respond, and then Dr. Barkin and anyone else?
Sure, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so I think first that women are at the forefront because it seems that for whatever reasons that women tend to be holding it down in terms of whether family, community, organization, movement, that it's something we do, we step up and we do what needs to be done. I think that seems to be kind of, I mean, not to stereotype or overgeneralize, because of course not everything applies to every person, but that's the patterns that we see in society. There's studies that show that this is the case worldwide, and so that's one thing. Another thing is that we are often on the front lines of impacts, and so therefore it makes sense that we would be stepping up to address to advance the solutions, and that we would be most placed to advance solutions because people who are on the front lines of the issue are definitely um, differentially qualified to identify what the solutions at work are. And so we see from the work that's happening around whether all the movements I've talked about, food justice, energy justice, we see women at the forefront of advancing these solutions. And then also, I mean, when we talk about mental health and healing justice, that the natural like healers in our society are often the women who are advancing healing justice informally or otherwise. And particularly as I've been talking a lot about climate grief in our communities and the losses that we're experiencing with climate grief and other types of losses in our communities, we're seeing the need and what's happening in terms of women stepping up into that space and holding space for sharing, for people to be able to speak and be heard, for people to be able to be seen, which is so critical to healing. And I've seen a lot of women stepping up and doing those informal and formal healing circles around this. So thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Barkin?
Yeah, when you were asking this question, I was just dying to answer it. Um, I think too, and we see this in the perinatal mental health world, regardless of like the income distribution, who's making more money in the household, the mom or the dad, or who's working and who isn't. Regardless of that, the woman is usually the primary caregiver, and that's just not trying to be biased or anything or hard on the dads, but it's just the truth. Women are more sensitized to health issues. If you can get at the mother, the whole family unit's going to benefit. If the mother's struggling, the whole family unit is going to suffer. So that's why perinatal mental health and anxiety disorders, it's the most common complication of childbearing. It's so important to address because that mother is, like you said, holding it down. With and I have an incredibly supportive husband and he is great with the kids, but I'm the one driving the dental appointments. I'm the one driving have they had their physical, have they had their flu shot? And I think, God, please don't, if anything happened to me, who would take them for their flu shot? And it's not because he's not a great person. He's just not as in tune with that. And I think an extension of that is the environmental piece. When my kids are telling me, I didn't feel quite right at recess, I'm real sensitized to it and I want to know why. And I think about, asthma developing in the future or things like that. And I just think some of that's societal and some of it's biological and the kind of the need to nurture, and the mother being kind of the lioness of and the protector of the family health. So I think it goes right in line with all of that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. In the interest of time, I want to pivot and see if there are questions from the audience or online questions. And if possible, if we could direct that question to an individual, that might be helpful, just in the interest of time.
Okay, so we have one from Rebecca who says, my work focuses on how the hormonal health issues women are experiencing mirror what the planet is experiencing as a result of climate change. Can you share some examples of connections or parallels between health challenges that women are facing with the challenges the planet is facing from your unique perspectives?
Did we get that all? And do we have someone who wants to respond? And let's not forget about Michelle on screen. So Michelle, I'll give you first dibs if you'd like to respond to that question.
Thank you for that question. You know, it makes me think about one of our particular affiliate groups, the Alaska Community Action Against Toxics, ACAT. You know, the works that we're engaged with them with chemical trespass and assault. Equally looking at how even some of these toxics that you heard addressed earlier on, how they are impacting the womb and our reproductive systems. I would encourage you to look, and I don't want to take up the time, but look at the works of folks like the ACAT, Vi Wahiki, and others, and the works that they have actually taken into the United Nations space that actually address those particular concerns that you have within your question.
Thank you. Is there another question from the audience? If not, I do have some additional ones. Okay, let me quickly pull it back up. So this question, so there was a mention, one of you mentioned the upcoming United Nations Climate Change Conference. And so as we're thinking about some of what you have laid out today in terms of what's happening, how communities are fighting for climate and health justice, how women are at the forefront of that leadership. And as Michelle, kind of brought to us that we are, we're in a moment now that has been worked for so many years. When we think about the environmental justice, pioneers, some who are still with us, some who are now deceased. This moment that we're in, at which we're really talking about looking at environmental justice from a whole of government approach, as Dr. Martinez talked about earlier, is something that is very significant. And so as we're thinking about this international conference, and we're thinking about those who will be representing us in the United States at this important convening, what are our greatest hopes and expectations for what can come out of this international meeting? And does it really matter to folks on the front lines, to communities who are dealing with these injustices day in and day out? Would either of you like to respond to that?
Well, I'll take a go, and I think this is an especially significant conference, maybe the most important since Rio in 1992. And one of the reasons for that is that the global arena has been one of the places where these issues of equity have been especially prominent, and it's one of the places where the U.S. governmental failures to address equity have been on display. For example, at Kyoto, what really prevented a really good outcome in Kyoto was the U.S. Congress's vote in advance of the meeting, tying the hands of the negotiators to not accept a solution that allowed for giving developing nations room to grow and develop, and didn't recognize the extraordinary pollution that's coming from the developed nations. And so what I think Glasgow has the potential to do is to put those principles of equity developed at the Bali meeting following the environmental justice principles from 1991 that puts global equity on the agenda. And it fortunately coincides with the moment when we have these, as Dr. Martinez referred to, a real willingness inside government to address those things. So I think that's part of why this is a especially significant meeting.
So one of the foci of this meeting is around labor in particular, and so we actually are working with Grassroots Global Justice, the Just Transition Alliance, and others, the National Black Environmental Justice Network, to have a delegation that will be Black labor, speaking about kind of frontline issues. A lot of times, either in the climate space, when they talk about just transition, it's being defined not by people whose jobs will be directly lost first as we shift away from the fossil fuel economy. And often, even when labor is represented, it's the grass tops of labor and not necessarily the actual people whose jobs are lost. And then even when we talk about labor, historically, African Americans have been marginalized within organized labor, and so that is shifting and improving, and we want to make sure that the specific issues that intersect race and labor are brought to the fore in the context of that labor discussion. And we're also linking with groups like the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance to talk about the linkages across nations as it relates to Black labor and this just transition. So thank you.
Thank you. As we prepare to come to our close, I want to ask maybe one last question that, yes. Oh, we do have another question. I'm so sorry.
You're all good. I would just firstly like to thank you guys for taking your time to speak today. For the first 15 years of my life, I lived in the far west side of Chicago, where it was a majority Latinx community. And most people I knew's main problem was finding food on the table and gang violence. And I was just wondering how we can normalize talking about mental health and climate change in these vulnerable communities.
Yeah. So as we've been talking kind of all day, and this is like a little bit tangential, but not. And this is similar to the concept that we talk about self-care all the time and new motherhood, you know, the mom taking care of herself so she doesn't get run down. And but there are resource constraints, right? So I feel like while we all need to do our part, I feel like a lot of the responsibility for thinking about how to advance this lies on the shoulders of those with resources. And the reason I say that is because if you're struggling, I think you said, to put food on the table, you have several jobs, little social support, you're a single mother, you know, you're barely making your rent. You have so little extra emotional and mental capacity to worry about something like climate change, which almost at that point sounds like a luxury to worry about, right? I mean, you're surviving, you're getting through the day. So I think that it's good for us to all have the awareness and for everyone to be educated. It drives me crazy how many plastic bags get handed out at the grocery store. I feel like that would be so easy to address in an employee training. You know, stop, this is excess. We do not need to do it. It'd be so easy to address. But that said, I think the real engine needs to be the people with resources protecting the communities without, because they have the luxury of the social capital and, you know, the energy and the resources to worry about it and to really make it move. So that's sort of a roundabout way of answering that question. I talk about it all the time. I just refuse to say anything other than climate change, because it's just, I'm not going to pretend this isn't real. I have a a student who's advanced into a doctoral program, and I won't name any names, but was a little disappointed in kind of the terminology that was being used around climate. No, it is climate change. That is what's happening. So I just don't even bother mincing words anymore. I'm very direct about how I talk about it, and I think it's kind of one way of educating people. But on the whole, I think the onus falls on, at least to lead the movement, those of us with resources, kind of like we're doing today.
Thank you. If I could ask one kind of final question and maybe give each panelist about 30 seconds to respond to this. I know that's short, but for anybody who is watching or in the audience today who has been inspired by the work that you all are doing and that you're talking about, what can folks do to get engaged in their local communities, wherever it is that they are? How can we get engaged in assisting or working with communities to advance health and climate justice? Michelle, let's let you start if you can.
Mindfulness is everything. You may see a call to action or support, for support, uh, and it could start everywhere from your basic school board. But mindfulness is everything. Just be aware. Just the very recent, and I'll make this exceptionally quick. The very recent storm, Hurricane Ida, it flooded many communities, and many communities never even had been flooded before, and they're grappling with that. So just understanding these various issues and impacts is enough, and being able to be mindful and assist.
Thank you. Jackie?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that as long as we all do something, it's a start. So I really want to take into account everything from ableism to privilege to all the different things that impact the what one's contribution can be, but recognizing that if we all do something, then it will the ripples will create a wave. So whether it is, I was in the Gulf after Hurricane Ida, and I was speaking to a friend who had a breakthrough case of COVID, and she was literally in her bed, and she's like, "What can I do? Like I can do research from my bed on my laptop," and so. Whether it's, so whatever it is that one can do to contribute is something. So starting a balcony garden, start sending a tweet, starting a conversation over Thanksgiving with that awkward uncle, whatever it is, just do something.
Thank you. Dr. Barkin?
Yeah, I mean, I'm coming at this from a little bit of a different angle. I mean, I do some advocacy, but kind of from like the mental health research angle. And just to kind of add on is that one thing that everyone we've interviewed about what drives their own climate anxiety about says is agency, right? So what makes them feel better is doing something, and what makes them feel worse is not doing anything at all. So it's actually doing something, even if it's small, is likely to be soothing to some degree. I also think we have to be careful not to put so much of the responsibility on any one individual, because like what was brought up earlier today, it's overwhelming to try and do all of it, to eliminate plastics, and there's a guilt associated with it. So I think to kind of carve out what you're able to do within your own personal situation. When I'm really busy, I know that I have a small donation going into NRDC every month. So kind of what works for your lifestyle, but also keeping in mind that agency and helping out actually makes people feel better.
Thank you.
Well, I think those individual actions are so critical. And it's also clear that what's brought us to this point is a robust collective reparative action. And so joining something, finding a group, linking up with one of the existing organizations that's working on climate. And if there isn't a group out there doing what you want to do, follow Greta Thunberg's example and start something new. I think that's an important step in raising public consciousness and making things happen.
Thank you so much, Dr. Spears. I think you've given us a great last word to end on. Thank you so much to our panelists for being with us here, both in person and virtually. And we are so appreciative of you spending some of your time and sharing about your work and giving us some inspiration so that we can all get engaged in this fight as we move ahead. Thank you so much.
What Nataki Osborne just doesn't know is I'm going to ask her to have the last word. Would you answer your question, that last question to the group?
Sure, I can do that. And really, I guess my answer is a combination of what's been said already. You know, I would say look for those local organizations that are doing the work, assist them in any way possible, whether it's, you know, making a donation, rolling up your sleeves, going to, you know, work in a community garden, helping to do research. You know, there's a lot that's really kind of spawned off now in terms of virtual research and, you know, online advocacy and that sort of thing. But I would just say find something, you know, something that is going to fit your passion and the expertise and or capacity that you have to make a difference, and just do something, get engaged.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. I don't know. I know I was so it was so great to hear people all day long talk about other sessions when they were doing theirs. So thanks to this panel and others who have been participating. And I'm not sure if Dr. Barkin had heard this, but you were in essence quoting Wanjira Matai, who said the same thing yesterday about she said it in terms of saying, the one thing we can't do is do nothing, right? So and that really is what everybody was saying in this wrap up. So grateful to the panelists, as Nataki said, and let me especially say how grateful we are to Nataki for helping us with this panel, helping us recruit and organize. I always say there's like a competition for the busiest woman in climate work, and usually I see Nataki sort of edging the rest of us out. So anyway. And then there's Jackie, who's flying from here to Alaska, but we won't even go there. But no, this is like a lot of our panelists, very busy group of people. This group did all travel. Michelle is of course, traveled to get on the Zoom or to get on the video. But thank you for taking the time to get here, to prepare, and then to be part of this panel today. So if we get a round of applause with our audience and for our virtual audience, thank you, thank you.